Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. 2 months after the discovery of 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops, British Columbia, the Tk'emlúps to Secwe Nation held a press conference to talk about the horrific findings. They say there might be far more graves still to be discovered. APTN's pemc was there and has more.
Tk'emlúps, I'm at a residential school 10 years. I attended the residential school for 10 years.
Survivors of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, like Evelyn Camille, shared their stories after details of the discovery of 215 children were released. Members of the Tk'emlúps to Secwe community held a press conference in Kamloops to give details on the discovery and where they plan to go next. Ground-penetrating radar specialist Dr. Sarah Boulot was part of the team to find the remains of those children. She says 160 acres of land around the institution still needs to be searched, and what they found so far barely scratches the surface.
All residential school landscapes are likely to contain burials of missing children. Between May 21st and 24th, 7,000 square meters of land, just under 2 acres, was covered in the location of the apple orchard at the Secwe Museum and Heritage Park. This area of interest was chosen for the survey based on a number of factors. First, the Knowledge Keepers' oral histories that recall children as young as 6 years old being woken in the night to dig holes for burials in the apple orchard. Second, a juvenile rib bone that surfaced in the same area. Third, a juvenile tooth that was excavated from a shovel test pit during an impact assessment conducted by Simon Fraser University's archaeology department.
Boulot says Indigenous values, protocols, and help from community members were essential.
Cultural protocols are as equally important as the science behind GPR. And given the nature and sensitivity of this work, one cannot be done without the other. It is important to note that remote sensing, such as GPR, is not necessary to know that children went missing in the Indian residential school context.
Cookbee Roseanne Casimir calls on Prime Minister Trudeau to share records of the school.
The Kamloops to Secwe has a responsibility and the obligation to identify the unmarked graves found within our jurisdiction. A critical first aspect to achieving those burdens is full and complete disclosure of the records held by the Canadian government and the Oblates of Mary Immaculate.
Newly elected AFN National Chief Roseanne Archibald says she is urgently working on the issue of the residential school sites across the country.
I did bring it up with the Prime Minister when I had my congratulatory call with him and indicated that on our first formal call this was a priority to ensure that First Nations had the resources and the funding to really complete this work.
Moving forward, Cookbee Casimir says programs will be available for Tk'emlúps that will reflect values and culture, as well as an oral telling project from residential school survivors.
The residential schools were specifically built to take the Indian out of us, to take away our language, culture, and traditions, and to make us some astute. But it did not work.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Kamloops.
Well, as you heard there, a number of survivors also spoke at the event. Here is some of what they had to say.
I attended the residential school for 10 years. I can't remember the age that I entered. On my 16th year, I tried to get letters home to tell my parents to come and pick me up on the day of my birthday so I can go home. But as many of you know, or may not know, that all letters sent home was censored. They tell us to write letters home to our parents, which made us very happy because it was the only contact we had with our parents, is some letters sent home. In my letters, I had tried to explain the abuse that was happening in residential schools. For me, it is very hard to talk about it. I didn't even talk about the abuse in residential schools to my children. And today they're shocked to hear all what is happening, especially finding of the babies.
I was taken from a loving home that only knew humor, laughter, love, and honor, put into a cold, stark environment that didn't honor or respect who we were, that could not comfort a 6-year-old who was crying, wanting to go home or wanting to be with her brother whom she was not allowed to speak with. I jumped on my brother's back going through those front doors, and they had to pry me from him. That was the first time we were ever separated.
I had about 12 siblings. Every one of us were fluent in the language, and my grandmother made sure of that. She absolutely refused to speak English. And when we went to the residential school, all of that changed. And when I got there at a young age, I couldn't understand anyone. I worked as a language coordinator for 15 years at the Tk'emlúps Cultural Education Society, and I spent my life reviving the language.
The AFN Regional Chief for British Columbia spoke with APTN after the event in Kamloops. He says in August, First Nations and BC communities will be meeting to discuss plans moving forward.
Perhaps there can be a concerted plan to deal with the many grave sites and really the rediscovery of these grave sites in the province of BC. Perhaps we should have a more national discussion and maybe a commission on all these residential school sites.
The findings at the Kamloops residential school were just the beginning of searches for graves across the country. The shocking news came in May of this year, and a lot has happened since, as APTN's Michelle Karlinzig takes us through it all.
It's been almost 2 months since the remains of 215 children were found at the former Indian residential school in Kamloops, BC. Since then, the discovery has sparked an awakening across Canada and international attention. Survivors are retelling their stories to shed light on Canada's dark history.
For breakfast was lumpy, uncooked mush with sour milk lots of times. The food truck used to come in at 5 in the morning. We could smell all that bread, and we couldn't have bread half the time, and we were so hungry.
Since late May, over 1,000 potential remains have been detected at former sites in Canada using ground-penetrating radar. The largest site, Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, where they found 751 unmarked graves.
The oral stories of our elders, of our survivors, and friends of our survivors have told us stories that knew these burials were here.
The Indigenous community across Canada has banded together during this traumatic reminder of Canada's history, making their mark on Catholic churches, marching in solidarity, and toppling over colonial statues. Efforts continue for the rest of residential school sites in Canada, with the federal government announcing $27 million towards memorializing and searching for sites, along with some provinces committing their own money. Based on death records, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation estimates that over 4,000 children died at residential schools in Canada, but says the total is likely much higher. Michelle Karlinzig, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for survivors and others who might need support. That number is 1-866-925-4419. A post on an RCMP Veterans Association website has led to some outrage, even within the ranks. More on that coming up after the break. Welcome back. An opinion piece posted to the RCMP Veterans Association webpage examines residential schools and Canada Day. It's called My Canada, Is It Your Canada? And the article suggests to get on with life. It said in part the TRC revealed many ugly truths from which we need to learn, not apologize for. Today's generations cannot be responsible for the actions of our forefathers. The Public Safety Minister's office denounced the piece and provided a statement saying, "We disagree strongly with material that denies pain and suffering caused by residential schools." The post calling for people to move on from residential schools caused a lot of reaction. It was followed up with an email to all members from the Manitoba chapter of the association. The email suggested members read a book called From Truth Comes Reconciliation, saying the book is not for people who think the subject and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report are too sacred for either discussion or criticism. And this book is for people with open minds, those who are willing to consider alternative perspectives. Retired Mountie Bruce Payne joined Daryl Stranger with his reaction.
Bruce, thanks for joining us. What was your reaction when you got the email from the Manitoba Association president?
Well, it was actually a bigger reaction than the previous editorial that came out, because at this point I realized there was a theme or an agenda that apparently was being pushed by the RCMP Veterans Association. And I was shocked that not necessarily the content of the book, that isn't what initially shocked me. It was the write-up that stressed that this is for people with open minds that are willing to consider alternative perspectives. And that appeared to be a theme then in relation to the previous editorial, which is very revisionist, very reductive to the damage and even the objectives of the residential schools.
So what exactly did it say inside of it?
It says, let me look at it here. From Truth Comes Reconciliation, fellow members. I would like to draw your attention to a very interesting book which many of our retired members may be interested in reading. This book is not for people who think the subject and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report are too sacred for either discussion or criticism. Rather, it is for ordinary Canadians. Then it goes on to say, this book is for people with open minds, those who are willing to consider alternative perspectives. So that was my issue here, is following an absolutely minimized version of history. This now goes along with that. What made it more disconcerting is that when I complained and aired my view to the author, the D Division, which is Manitoba, president of the Vets Association, all I got back was a short reply that said it is acknowledged. Your email is acknowledged and you are certainly entitled to your opinion. If that was any other organization that you belong to, I think anybody would be upset at the glib response and superficial response.
So, Bruce, what needs to happen for RCMP veterans to really understand how the residential schools affected Indigenous people?
Well, and this is the interesting point, and I want to be clear here. I'm not here to tell anybody the point of view, but it shouldn't be one, and it shouldn't be just an alternate point of view. There are many books, there's much material out there. Soak it all in. Don't just allow an organization to persuade you to read one side. That's confirmation bias. That doesn't do anybody any good. We don't learn that way.
Why do you think there is such a misunderstanding?
That I'm not sure of. I'm just very shocked. I don't know why it is, other than it does point the finger towards systemic racism within the RCMP, because these people that are in the Veterans Association Many are recently retired. They would have been direct supervisors to serving members. They have a voice, and I think they should use it properly.
All right, Bruce, thank you for joining us. That's all the questions we have.
You're very welcome.
Now, the Veterans Association sent us a statement saying the post was an editorial and not associated with the organization. We also contacted the Manitoba president but have not heard back. You can read the association's entire statement on our website at APTN News or at aptnnews.ca. We heard from many people who were outraged by the post, including former Mountie Marjorie Hudson. Brittany Guillot has that part of the story.
An opinion piece posted to the RCMP Veterans Association webpage outraged many people, including Grand Chief Jerry Daniels of the Southern Chiefs organization, who spoke to APTN News this week.
Obviously, we're never really surprised of these sorts of comments from colonial institutions. I think that we were a little disheartened given the fact that multiple reports have came out stating that the RCMP is an institution that needs to be transformed and brought into the 21st century.
The article examines residential schools and Canada Day, titled, "My Canada, Is It Your Canada?" The article suggests to get on with life and move on from residential schools. That email encouraged members to read a book called From Truth Comes Reconciliation. Retired Mountie Bruce Pitt Payne shared the article and email with APTN News.
It was the write-up that stressed that this is for people with open minds that are willing to consider alternative perspectives. And that appeared to be a theme then in relation to the previous editorial, which is very revisionist, very reductive to the damage and even the objectives of the residential schools.
The Veterans Association sent us a statement saying the post was an editorial and not associated with the organization. The post is scrubbed from their website. APTN News spoke with Marjorie Hudson about the content. The former RCMP officer tells us why she thinks the comments are troubling.
With the residential school and the police, I think it runs parallel. Because we have to remember that the RCMP was part of the taking of the children.
Hudson filed a class action lawsuit last year alleging racism and sexism within the force. We reached out to the RCMP for comment but didn't hear back before airtime. Brittany Guillot, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Still to come, we'll visit a Dene Métis community that conducted a search on the grounds of a former residential school 30 years ago. Stick around.